It looked like a regular portrait of a mother and her daughters until you noticed their hands. Dr. James Mitchell had spent 15 years digging through photo archives at the New York Historical Society, but he'd never seen anything like this. The image came in a donation box from a Brooklyn estate sale. Inside were dozens of old glass plate negatives, each wrapped in faded newspaper from 1923. Most of the photos were typical for the late 1800s. Serious-looking merchants, wedding groups, kids dressed up for Sunday. But one picture stood out. 3 black women looked straight into the camera. A woman in her 40s, sitting in a carved wooden chair, with her 2 daughters, probably in their late teens or early 20s, standing on either side. They wore elegant, high-collared dresses with fine lace details. Their hair was styled neatly. The background was a painted garden, the kind used in studio portraits back then. What caught James's attention wasn't their clothes or expressions. It was their hands. The mother rested her hands in her lap, fingers interlaced in a very specific way. Her right thumb crossed over her left, and her index and middle fingers pointed out, while the others curled in. Each daughter had one hand placed gently on their mother's shoulders, and their fingers were arranged just as carefully. James had studied thousands of portraits from the Victorian era. Usually, people kept their hands still, folded or resting naturally, because long exposure times required complete stillness. Every pose in those photos was planned. So the hand positions in this photo didn't look random. They looked intentional. He grabbed a magnifying glass and took a closer look at the negative. In the lower right corner, barely visible, someone had scratched a small number into the glass. New York 892247. James couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, back at his apartment on the Upper West Side, he spread out his research materials across the dining table. He had taken a high-resolution photo of the negative, and now the image filled his laptop screen. The detail was incredible for 1892. He could make out the fabric's texture, a small brooch on the mother's collar, even slight differences in the daughters' faces. But again, his focus went straight to their hands. He zoomed in. The shapes the fingers made weren't accidental. The mother's right thumb crossed over in a way that took effort to hold. Her extended fingers created a distinct shape. Her daughter's hands echoed that same pattern, with fingers bent at specific angles. It was clearly done on purpose. James had studied Civil War-era photos, post-emancipation documents, and early 1900s reform movements. He knew that people back then used signs and symbols to send hidden messages, through posture, props, and hand positions, that only certain viewers would understand. He opened his database of abolitionist and early activist networks. He thought about how the Underground Railroad had used codes in songs, quilts, and symbols. But this photo was from 1892, nearly 30 years after slavery officially ended, and 15 years after Reconstruction fell apart. Who would still need secret signals? Just then his phone buzzed. It was Dr. Sarah Chun, an expert in African American history, replying to his earlier message. Free tomorrow morning. What did you find? He texted back, something that might change what we know about black activism in New York after Reconstruction. Bring your notes on property rights and documentation issues. The next morning at 9 sharp, Sarah walked into the Historical Society, carrying a worn leather satchel full of research. James had the portrait projected on the wall of the research room, larger than life. The 3 women looked out from the image, calm and proud. Check out their hands, James said, pointing with a laser. Every finger is placed with care. Sarah stepped closer, studying the photo. She opened her satchel and pulled out a thick folder. After Reconstruction ended in 1877, she said, black families in the North faced a different struggle, not slavery, but being shut out of basic rights. Property, inheritance, even proving who you were, all of it became a battle. She laid out old documents on the table. Legal forms, city records, newspaper articles from the 1880s and 1890s. People think New York was progressive, she said. It wasn't. Black families had to fight to keep their homes, open businesses, or even prove they were married. Many came north with no official documents. No birth certificates, no marriage records, just their word. James picked up an old newspaper from 1891. The headline read, Property dispute in Harlem. Family claims ownership without paperwork. Exactly, Sarah nodded. That's why I've been digging into mutual aid groups from that time. Black communities built their own networks to help each other deal with all this. They pooled their money to hire lawyers, traded tips about friendly officials, and set up their own ways to verify identity when the system left them out. Secret networks, James said quietly. Not secret as in hidden, Sarah replied. More like separate. These were systems running alongside the official ones, using tools that white authorities either missed or didn't understand. James looked back at the portrait. What if this isn't just a family photo? What if it's proof, a form of record? That small number scratched into the corner, New York 1892247, turned out to be the clue they needed. After 2 days of combing through city records and business directories, James found something. Studio 247. It belonged to a photographer named Thomas Wright, who worked out of a building on 8th Avenue between 1888 and 1896. The building was still there, though it had been turned into apartments long ago. James stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the old brick, trying to picture it as it once was. Wright's studio would have been on the second floor, with big north-facing windows, perfect for portrait lighting. Looking into Wright's background revealed a surprise. He was white, born in Massachusetts in 1851, trained as a photographer in Boston. He moved to New York in 1887 and opened his studio in a neighborhood becoming more diverse, Irish, Italian, and black families moving in from the South. But unlike most white photographers of the time, Wright was different. While many refused to work with black clients or charged them extra, Wright placed ads in black newspapers. His studio welcomed everyone, and his prices were the same for all. Sarah found an old interview Wright gave to a small progressive newspaper in 1894. He talked about photography as a way to give people dignity and to preserve their lives on record. Everyone deserved a good portrait, he said, no matter where they came from. Reading between the lines, James saw something deeper, a quiet kind of activism. Wright had made a choice to serve the people others left out. He was an ally, Sarah said, looking over James's shoulder. And if these hand gestures are a form of code, he probably helped design them, photographed them, and made sure they got the right people. James reached out to Dr. Marcus Thompson, a cryptography expert at Columbia University who studied hidden communication systems. Marcus arrived at the Historical Society that afternoon, curious after James's vague but urgent call. Codes from the Victorian era might seem overly complicated today, Marcus said, as he studied the photo. But for the people using them, they were usually practical. It's all about context, who needed to send a message, what they needed to say, and who they had to keep it from. He took several photos of the hand positioned from different angles, then opened his laptop and began creating digital outlines of each one. Let's assume every hand position means something specific, Marcus said. Probably not letters. Too complex for a single photo. More likely categories. Maybe confirmation of identity or status. Sarah pulled out her files on the challenges black families faced proving who they were. What if it's a way to confirm identity, she said. These networks needed ways to prove someone belonged, that they were trustworthy, without using official documents. Marcus nodded. Exactly. The mother's hand could show she's the head of the household or a trusted member of the network. The daughter's hand positions might show their status, documented, undocumented, or in need of support. They spent the rest of the afternoon comparing this portrait with others James had found in the same donation box. 3 more photos showed similar hand gestures, always subtle, always done with purpose. In one, a couple's joined hands formed a shape. In another, a man placed his hand on a Bible, specific fingers extended. This isn't just one code, Marcus finally said. It's a full system. Multiple signals combined in different ways to send different messages. Someone trained these families on how to pose. Someone took these photos with intent, and others, network members, knew how to read them. Then Sarah made the connection that opened everything up. While researching property rights cases in New York courts from the 1890s, she saw a trend. Dozens of black families had successfully defended their claims of property, gotten official ID papers, or proved they were legally married and many of them were represented by the same lawyer. One name kept coming up again and again: Robert Hayes. His office was on West 34th Street. Court records showed he had won a surprising number of cases for black clients during a time when legal wins like that were incredibly rare. But more interestingly, he often submitted photographs as evidence. Family portraits that showed not just identity, but community presence and respectability. James made the connection. Wright's portraits weren't just photos. Hayes had been using them in court to prove who these families were, and that they were part of a stable, active community. These families had their portraits taken, their images archived, and when they needed proof for court, for property, for identity, Hayes presented those photos to judges. But there was even more. In the archive of Hayes's case files at the New York Public Library, Sarah found letters, correspondence between Hayes and teachers, ministers, business owners, and fellow activists. They talked about how to confirm identities and build systems of community documentation. One letter from March 1893 stood out. Hayes wrote to a Brooklyn minister, "We have expanded our photographic documentation to include 73 families. Mr. Wright continues to offer his services at minimal cost. The hand positioning system lets us encode key information that can later be verified. Each portrait works as both a respectful image and practical ID." James leaned back in his chair, stunned. They had built their own documentation system. When the official channels failed them, these families didn't wait. They created something else, something that looked ordinary to outsiders. They hid it in plain sight, Sarah said. To most people, these were just family portraits. But to those in the network, every hand position meant something. Each image carried essential information, invisible unless you knew how to read it. With the structure of the network now coming into focus, James became determined to find out who the 3 women in the original portrait were. The estate sale where the negative came from was tied to a brownstone in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, a neighborhood with deep African-American roots. Historical Society records listed the name of the seller, Patricia Johnson. She had inherited the home from her grandmother. James called her that evening. Patricia was 72, sharp and a bit guarded at first, unsure why someone was so interested in an old photo. But when James described the portrait in detail, her tone softened. "That's my great-grandmother," she said quietly. Ella Laner Morrison. The daughters would be my grandmother Ruth and her sister Grace. "Can you tell me about them?" James asked. There was a pause. Ella Laner was born enslaved in Virginia, Patricia said. She came north after the war with Ruth, who was just a baby. Grace was born here in New York. Ella Laner worked as a seamstress. She was known for her lace work. That's how she supported the family. Did she ever mention being part of any groups or organizations? She was active in her church, Patricia said, always helping people. My grandmother said she helped families with their paperwork, helped them find housing, put them in touch with lawyers. She just seemed to know how to navigate the system. James felt a rush of energy. "Patricia, I think your great-grandmother was part of something big, a network that helped African-American families document who they were and defend their rights after Reconstruction." Patricia didn't speak at first. When she did, her voice was thick with emotion. "I always knew she was someone special, but so much history was lost. After she died in 1919, our family scattered. My grandmother rarely talked about those early years." With Patricia's blessing, James and Sarah began tracing Ella Laner Morrison's connections. Church records from Bethel Church in Brooklyn showed she had been a member from 1879 until her death. She served on the Ladies' Aid Society, which was officially a charity group, but meeting notes revealed something deeper. The group kept detailed records of the families they helped, names, ages, situations, needs. And some entries included odd codes, numbers and letters that didn't make sense, until Sarah saw a pattern. "These match Thomas Wright's numbering system," she said to James. They were cross-referencing. The church identified families who needed documents. Wright took their photos with the correct hand signals. Hayes brought those portraits to court, and the church kept track of all, hidden inside the paperwork of charitable work. Then James made a discovery in Wright's archive after Wright's death in 1923. The Historical Society had acquired his full collection, but no one had properly sorted it. Now, going through it, James found dozens of portraits using the same hand signaling system. Families photographed between 1890 and 1896. Each image was carefully numbered, a quiet record of people shut out of official systems. James and Sarah uncovered others in the network. Samuel Brooks, a teacher helping families get school records. Mary Chun, a clerk ensuring property deeds were filed. Reverend James Washington, who performed and documented marriages when the city wouldn't. Each quietly used their role to help. Together, they built a shadow archive, a community effort to protect dignity when institutions failed. 3 months in, James and Sarah launched an exhibit at the Historical Society featuring 20 of Wright's portraits. Each showed the coded hand signals and the family stories. Patricia Johnson attended with her daughter and granddaughter, standing before the portrait of her great-grandmother, Ella Laner Morrison, the image that started it all. Other descendants came too. Many brought pieces of the puzzle, old letters, documents, stories. Thomas Hayes saw his great-grandfather's photo. Robert Hayes, a lawyer, his hands in the same coded pose. Grace Brooks, viewing Samuel Brooks' portrait, said, "They said he helped with false papers. I don't think they were false. I think he was helping people get what they deserved." The New York Times ran a headline, "Hidden in plain sight." The portrait had become more than history. It became a bridge across time,